It is.
Yeah.
You've worked more than 40 years or 40 years on trauma.
Yeah.
Why did you, and how did you get interested in trauma, and what have you found that has evolved over these 40 years?
We rationalize everything, like I can give you a rationale how I got into trauma. It's probably not quite how it is. I was just fascinated. And quite an important part of my background is that I was born in 1943 during the Second World War. My generation was very severely traumatized kids. A lot of kids died. I was a very sickly child myself, so I held a lot of stuff in my own body. My father was in a German camp because of a resistor. And then my father ran the household like a Nazi. And as a little kid, I would say to my dad, "Hey, Dad, you were in a camp because fighting Nazis, and now you sound like a Nazi yourself." I was like 3 years old. My father didn't always like that, but I was always intrigued with the difference what people said and what the people do. And I've always also had an interest in art and literature, but also in science. For me, the study of trauma brought together neuroscience, my interest in social issues, my interest in intrapsychic issues. It was the right thing for me to do.
Yeah, and so how, I know many people know, but how do you define trauma, or what did you find that is really like the core of trauma?
Well, the trauma issue, which now has become inflated and made relatively meaningless, trauma really is an experience that leaves you befuddled, terrified, horrified, lost, God forsaken. It's like the ultimate, oh my God experience. And then I had the good luck of having been part of the first and only study, interestingly enough, of people reliving their trauma in a scanner. You couldn't do that today because it's too traumatic actually to do that, because people feel like they're getting raped in a scanner. And what we saw there is that the left brain, the cognitive brain, entirely disappears, and particularly the speech area of the brain disappears. And I'm sure that in French, doesn't come to mind right now, there must be a word for dumbfounded or struck with speechless terror. Because every language has a word for that. You're at a loss for words. It's sans parole. Huh? And so what became very clear is that trauma is a response that your organism, your being develops, where it keeps sort of being afraid it's going to happen again, and you cannot make it into a memory, but it becomes a presence that lives inside of your system. And when you go back into your trauma, you feel like it's happening right now. It's not like, oh, this reminds me about when I was being molested. No, you feel like you're being molested. And so it's a different memory system. And I got really interested in that different memory system and how something can become a memory instead of you get stuck in that sensation. And getting stuck is the big issue, and I think our field doesn't really totally appreciate yet to what degree people get stuck. Of course, the Frenchman Pierre Janet, who really was the first person who spelled this all out, and who the French should read much more because he was absolutely brilliant, a hell of a lot more brilliant than Sigmund Freud. He spelled it out that it's an integrated experience, and once you get traumatized, you get arrêté. The maturation of your brain stops maturing in a way. Part of you goes on, and part of you gets stuck. And then Genet also back in 1889, 1893 says, and it takes an enormous amount of energy to keep things under control because your body keeps sending you messages, I'm in danger. You try not to embarrass yourself and scream at people and hit people, which would be completely inappropriate, even though you're likely to do that sometimes. And then so you get very afraid of yourself. and you get afraid of your own memories. And then, as Jeanette says, that the energy to try to keep yourself under control is so intense that there is hardly any room for anything else. And in some ways, trauma causes people to get stuck and to have a hard time growing and learning from experience. So, too bad you couldn't interview Pierre Genet, because he said it all beautifully.
Yeah. And do you think that in those 40 years of working with trauma and trauma survivors, now we say trauma survivors because it's like what we did,
Yeah, why not?
we survived something that
Yeah,
we could have died from.
yeah.
Do you think what has changed from the beginning to now? In the nature of trauma, but also the way we treat trauma today?
Well, the beginning was actually very exciting. And that is that a lot of people around the same time woke up to the issue of trauma. And the usual academic stuff that happens between people wasn't happening. And everybody was incredibly curious and incredibly open for learning from each other. So the early years as a honeymoon period, that you see a little bit of psychedelics today, of there's not a lot of competition yet. And like when you mentioned Peter Levine and Pat Ogden, we're all buddies, we hang out together, we showed each other our work. And it was a very heady time that we were all curious and wondered what else can you do to help people. And then what happened is very much led by America, is people say, I've done the research and I found the right treatment. I found a treatment of choice. And then I think sort of the whole field fell apart. And I could show you the unbelievable amount of nasty interchange that occur between different people with different groups, and how that's a bad person and that's a good person. And so we became regular human beings again. Like old Europe, always fighting with each other. And so that's sort of, the field is, these days, is sort of a fighting field. Not a field anymore where it started off collaboration and people saying, Peter Levine showing me his work and go like, wow, Peter, that's really fantastic. And then being involved in the theater group for traumatized kids and go like, yeah, these kids moving together, singing together, that's really good for people. Oh, and then we can neurofeedback and we can rewire people's brains. That's also amazing. And so people started off being very Catholic in a way, very open-minded to look at the whole field of possibilities. And then as the field matured, people became immature and started saying, my method is better than your method, and you should pay me and not you. And so, and the big thing that is missing, that was missing from the very beginning, is that we started off studying Vietnam veterans. And we started off pretending, although we knew better than that it was the war that had messed them up. As we interviewed these guys for the PTSD diagnosis, we very quickly saw that a lot of them had a lot of early childhood trauma. But for political reasons, we decided to ignore the childhood trauma and pretend it was all because of the war, so that our Veterans Administration would pay for the treatment and not muck it up by it was really the parents or something else. And so we simplified it. And the way we also originally formulated this, says it's an extraordinary, rare experience outside of the usual realm of human experience. And that has changed. Today we know that at least a third to a quarter of all people have had traumatic experiences, and that at least 1 out of 4 or 5 women get sexually molested. At least about a quarter of all kids get quite severely hit in nasty ways by their caregivers. About a third of all couples engage in domestic violence. So turned out that trauma is extremely common, and psychiatry has had a hard time. So I had done all this work to spelling this out, and my colleagues also, and the American Psychiatric Association very deliberately did not want to put in the issue of developmental trauma, because they said if we do that, we'll have to reformulate the whole field of psychiatry. And my reaction is, yes, you would. And so people continue to talk about these different diagnoses as being totally unrelated to each other. Depression, anxiety, drug addiction, anorexia, and self-mutilation, they're all different. I just came off a podcast, comorbid conditions. No, they're not comorbid conditions. They all happen in the same people. It's the whole organism that goes wrong. So when you start talking about the whole organism, the issue of the body becomes very important. And I'm very glad that you had Pat Ogden and Peter Levine here, because they really are superb body people. And I think that work should be part of all of our therapeutic skills, actually, is to learn with work with the body. And the other thing that slowly emerged, which I'll talk about when we talk about psychedelics, is that the majority of people are not traumatized by some outside thing. They're traumatized in the context of their own attachment relationships. And now we call everything trauma, but a lot of what we call trauma is in fact about disrupted attachments and your identity that you have formed in the context of being an unwanted or a hurt child. And that's different from being a war soldier. So it needs different approaches. And I feel it's become very sloppy in that regard.
I know developmental trauma has been like your mission to so that people recognized one of them. There are so many, but and it's still hard to have that recognized. It's still not in the DSM.
Right.
And it's something you wanted to be in the DSM because it's so important to take that into account.
We needed DSM because if we give people diagnosis, we need to actually give people diagnoses and not bullshit diagnosis. Like if your problems stem from having been abused and neglected by your own parents, you should be able to say that's the problem. And so to call something else, what's interesting to me is that when I talk about this with groups of clinicians, which I do all the time, they usually start applauding when they start talking about what a nonsense diagnostic system we live in. And then they go on using the same diagnoses. And then I say, the problem is you, that you keep buying into this system. And you hope that somebody, me, will change the system for you. No, you have to change the system. I've done all the work I could do, but unless clinicians start actually insisting on making honest diagnoses, the field's not going to change.